Hi, this is Jeff Jarvis again from Long Beach, California, and I'm once again very pleased to be presenting the second Masterclass for EuropaFest 2020. In the first class, we discussed some things about getting started with jazz improvisation and getting back to basics, and I'd like to stay along with that, stay on that topic for just 1 minute. The getting back to basics thing is something that is important regardless of your ability level. A good case in point there is there's a very well-known studio player here in town who's been playing on a lot of movie calls named Gary Foster. Very great, good alto sax player, and he plays all the woodwinds. And about once a year, he goes and takes what he calls a tune-up lesson with, say, the flute player from the L.A. Philharmonic. Or he'll take a clarinet lesson from the clarinet soloist in the Los Angeles Philharmonic, just to make sure that he hasn't developed any bad habits, or if he's having a problem. Well, in much the same way, when Tiger Woods was at his peak of winning golf tournaments, he experienced a losing streak. So he went back to his coach, and what did his coach do? He took him all the way back to the beginning. And at first, Tiger said in an interview he was a little resistant because he was talking about the kind of stuff that his coach talked about back in Cypress, California when he was a little kid. But what the coach was doing was taking him all the way back to the basics because Tiger developed some habits that were very effective in hitting the ball a long way, but he was hurting his back. So he had to actually relearn his swing. Well, we had something like that happen here at Cal State Long Beach when one of my trumpet players had some embouchure problems. He was having trouble with his endurance and his range, and his trumpet teacher completely changed his embouchure. Well, like the situation with Tiger Woods, this required a huge leap of faith because before he improved his playing, he had to go back to the beginning and almost start over again. He had the trumpet ability, but he was playing on new muscles. And it took a while before he was able to get back to where he was, but then he started going beyond there. He was able to get better endurance. He was able to get better range, but it took a few months of having the courage to sound bad when he was practicing. You know, we're human beings. We want to sound good, and we're also creatures of habit. We do things the same way over and over and over again, even if they don't work. Another instance of where somebody needed to go back to the basics was a saxophone player that played in my college band. He was a very gifted soloist. He played really great solos, very complex and sophisticated. But he started experiencing some problems where he would get to places where he wasn't comfortable with the chord changes, and he had little workarounds. He had little things that he would do that sounded impressive, but you could kind of tell if you knew his playing that he was a little bit lost and he was trying to cover it up. And he got a little bit upset with himself, and he came to me and says, "Man, what can I do about this? I really got to get this together." And I said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I've been noticing when I'm conducting the band and you play a solo, what's been going on. And what we're going to do is we're going to go right back to the beginning. We're going to go to the very basic structure of chords and start there." Well, I told him I wanted to work on guide tones, the very things on which chords are built, which is the third and the seventh. It defines the chord. It tells you whether it's major, whether it's minor, etc. And if you know where those guide tones are, you can always get back on track. Well, he kind of giggled and he said, "Well, this sounds like what I was doing in camp when I was in junior high school." And I said, "Well, you know what? Let's just try it." And so I said, "We're going to do a B-flat blues, and I want you to play nothing but guide tones. Whenever a new chord happens, all you're allowed to play is the third or the seventh, any way you want to play it, whether it's slow notes, fast notes, I don't care." He couldn't do it. And here was a guy that was impressing crowds like crazy with his solos, and something this simple he couldn't do. So this was kind of Tiger Woods relearning his swing, and he practiced it, and he really committed to it, and he completely fixed the problem that he was having. And so it worked. So what I'd like to do now is demonstrate that concept of guide tones and how we first identify those notes that define the chord, and then we use them and try to get as many of them into our soloing ideas as possible. So when I first started working with a saxophone student, what I did was I remember I made him just play nothing but the guide tones. So in the key of ending on an A flat major 7, doing a 2-5-1 pattern, I told him all you're allowed to do is play those guide tones, and this is kind of what it sounded like. Here we go. 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3. Now the next step would be still only using the guide tones, but now this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to do what's called voice leading. When I get to the next note, I'm going to find a note that's as close as possible to my ending note to play to change the chord. So I'll show you that right now. Here we go. 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3. Same notes, but they led more comfortably in another because I got to the bottom note and I stayed on that bottom note because it was the closest one. It was the same note. So now what I'm going to do is, with Alex's help, we're going to start on that same 2-5-1, except I'm going to use the guide tones to construct my ideas. You're going to hear me first lean a little bit closer to the guide tones, and then you're going to hear a lot more connecting material going into each chord. So this is going to be starting with a concert B flat minor 7, and we're just going to go chromatically up from there. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And we can keep going all through the 12 keys. But that's a good idea of what I did with this student. And then I said, now what I want you to do, now that you've got those firmly in your brain, is to start constructing your own ideas using those guide tones or referring back to them. I think of this like as if I just fell off a ship and I'm in the ocean and all of a sudden somebody throws me a life preserver. That's what a guide tone is to me. I can reach out and grab that guide tone and get back on track. So if I feel myself getting a little bit lost in the tune, those guide tones are going to get me right back in there. Building on the skills that we just reinforced having to do with the guide tones, there's another way that you can really internalize the chords to a song that you're learning. One of the great jazz pioneers in the United States, and I'm sure he's well known all over the world, is Jamie Aebersold. He's published a lot of books and recordings, play-along recordings to help improvisers. And one of the things from his early books was a way to really learn what a chord sounds like that you're trying to learn in a tune, or to learn all the chords in a tune. It's playing that chord inside and out, frontwards, backwards, as a scale, as an arpeggio, as you know, breaking up those notes into thirds. And it's a 12-step system here, and I'm going to read these off to you right now. The first step is playing the root of the chord, the 1, if we're going to give the notes numbers. Then playing the 1 and the 2, the 1, 2, and 3, the first 3 notes, the first 5 notes. And then what happens is we play the arpeggio as a triad, 1, 3, 5, 5, 3, 1. After we do the triad, then we go to the 7th chord, 1, 3, 5, 7, and back down. Then we extend it up to the 9th. And then after we finish doing that, we play up the scale to the 9th and down again, all scales. Now we play up to the 6th in an arpeggio, 1, 3, 5, 6, and back down. That gets the 13th sound of the chord. Then we play up the scale to the 9th, down the chords, up the chord, down the scale. Then we break it up into thirds, da 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 da, 1, 3, 2, 4, and etc. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Alex play a E flat 7 while I use this 12-step system, and you'll hear me go through all 12 steps as you can following along on the graphic on your screen. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Now, once we're comfortable with what notes we're going to play, how we're going to play them, whether we're playing arpeggios, whether we're playing scales, whether we're playing broken thirds, what have you, one of the things that's critically important in soloing, whether you're reading music or improvising the music, is time, a time feel. Now, let's figure that most of your audience is not musicians. And if you played a note that was a little bit questionable, that may not fit that chord, most of those people wouldn't notice that. But everybody will notice bad time because everybody dances, everybody listens to music, and they can tell when something doesn't quite feel right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a B-flat blues with Alex, and I'm going to play correct notes, but my time feel is going to be a little off. Here you go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So all the ideas, even though they were pretty simple ideas, they fit those chords. The problem was there was no groove. I was not following the time that Alex was very clearly laying out for me. So time is of the essence because, like I said, everybody can hear bad time. Now, the next step that I feel is very, very important as far as learning to improvise or improving your improvisation is to make sure that there's good rhythmic content in your solos. Many times when I'm hearing especially beginning and intermediate improvisers, I'll hear students that I can tell have figured out the right notes to play, but I still hear a lot of rhythms that get repeated over and over again. Ba 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 da ba, ba 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 da ba, ba da ba ba da ba, ba 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 da ba. Sounds almost like a iambic pentameter in a poem. So what I did was in a pedagogy book that I wrote, I put some exercises in the addendum in the back of the book, and I wrote exercises based on swing rhythms. Now, a friend of mine named Doug Beach, another fine writer, and he and I wrote the pedagogy book together. He and I looked around at big band charts. I think we each took about 10 charts apiece, and we tried to write down all the swing rhythms that we saw. And after we cross-referenced what we found, we discovered that there was only 14 swing rhythms that get used throughout most of the swing music. And some of them were varieties of those rhythms. So what we did is we wrote the 14 rhythms, we put it in the back of the book. Then I took it one step further and I wrote a bunch of exercises based on those 14 rhythms. I had about, what have I got here? I've got 10 in one group, which is all rhythms that start on the beat. Then I had group B, which is it starts on the upbeat. Then I had group C, which anticipates the measure. So Alex and I will demonstrate this in just a second. What I would do when I'm working with large groups of students in a camp situation or a clinic situation is I try to make the exercise have two benefits. They're improving their rhythmic content, and the other thing is that they're also reinforcing their scales or maybe even learning new ones. So what I will do is, let's say there's 10 exercises in group A. I'll pick an exercise and have the students play, say, a Dorian scale in the key of F on rhythm number 5, and that way that's how we would warm up every day in these camp situations, and they're getting their scales together in the meantime. So I'm going to demonstrate that right now and as we'll put up a graphic here on the screen so you can follow along. What we're going to do, let's see, let me pick one. We're going to go group A, and I'm going to go number 5, which the rhythm is bop, ba, ba, da, bop, ba, ba, da. And I'm going to do an F Dorian scale on that rhythm, up to 9th and back. Okay. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Okay, now that was the on the beat rhythms, and there's 10 of those. Next, what we'll do is we'll move into group B, which is rhythms that start on an upbeat. And we'll go a little bit more daring on this one. Let's do this would be your B flat Lydian dominant. So I'm going to first play the notes, and this is what I would do to the students, play the notes that's in the concert B flat Lydian dominant scale, which means I'm going to have a sharp 4, and I'm going to have a 7. And what that is going to fit to is if you played a 7th chord that had a sharp 11, which is an octave above the sharp 4. In fact, can you play that chord for me? Okay. Now what we'll do is I'll play that rhythm that I didn't decide which rhythm it was yet. Let's see. This is on the upbeat. Let's do number 2, and this would be the what did I say, B flat? Yep. Yes, it's a B flat 7 sharp 11, which means we're using the Lydian dominant scale. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Great, now I'm going to move on to group C, and this is where you anticipate the measure, normally by an 8th note. And let me pick out a rhythm here. Pick out rhythm number 7, and what we're going to do is we're going to just do a regular dominant chord. This will be an F7, an F dominant chord, and using rhythm number 7. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. The next technique I'd like to talk about is what I call chord cells. Rather than sound really etude-ish by playing up and down scales in order, which is what your brain tends to want you to do because of the fact that you've practiced scales up and down and so forth, what I'd like to do is try to find the most colorful notes in the chord Just like I was talking about with the arpeggios, which lead you to the correct notes in the chord. But let's say we've got a chord like a B flat 7 with a sharp 11. Well, there's a lot of notes in that chord that I can play. There's a lot of connecting material that I can play. But the two notes that really stand out to me, which you can see in the graphic that I've put up here, is the sharp 11 and the 7th. Those are the two coolest notes in that chord, the two most colorful notes. So I'm going to play that scale up and down, and then I'm going to play those two notes, and then I'm going to play some notes in between. That's the sharp 11 or the sharp 4, and that's our flat 7. Now what happens is I'm going to play in between those two notes, and what I'm doing is I'm making sure that I've isolated those colorful chord tones, and I want to get a lot of those into my solo. So here's some connecting material between the two. And by isolating those notes, I make it easier on myself because I have less notes to think about. I can always put some extra notes in from that scale, but as long as I'm thinking about those two notes, I'm going to make sure that I'm hitting the most important notes in the chord during my solo. So I'm going to have Alex play with me right now, and I'm going to pretty much govern myself to playing within those tones, and then I may stretch a little bit, but I'm still going to emphasize those tones a lot. Here we go. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. You'll notice that while I was playing that little solo, I started doing some of the things from the Jamie Aebersold 12-step system, where I started playing thirds. I put in a few ornaments, the ornaments on the Christmas tree, to make it look a little more colorful. And I was able to put together a solo that really sounded like it was harmonically more sophisticated because I was stressing the most interesting notes in that chord. The next technique I'd like to talk about has to do with how to solo over some of those big, long chords that have all kinds of stuff in parentheses. This would be the altered dominant chords. When you see a chord that says D flat, augmented 7, sharp 9, flat 9, well, when most people see that chord, the first thing they're going to do is, well, I want to at least get the root. And, oh, it's a 7th chord. Well, never mind that stuff in the parentheses. That's too much to think about right now because I have an entire 2 beats to figure out what I'm going to play. So this is a way for you to isolate, once again, just like we did with the guide tones and the way we did with the chord cells, a way to isolate, again, very, very colorful notes of the chord. This was from a piano book that was written by the late, great Frank Mantooth, a wonderful educator, piano player, and fantastic writer that I was fortunate enough to publish. I'd love to say that he was discovered when I bought the company, but he predated me, and he's a wonderful, wonderful player. In fact, he did a lot of playing over in Europe. I think he was in Graz, Vienna for some time. I think that was the Graz School of Music or something like that. But he was in Vienna, and so he's gotten around the world pretty well. What we're doing is we're dealing with altered dominant chords, and this also works for suspended chords as well. If you've got a dominant suspended chord like a C7 sus or a C13 suspended chord, this will work with that as well. As you can see on the graphic, what I did was I used an X when I wanted to denote that there was no tonality. It just is a neutral tonality. It can be C, D, E, E flat, whatever. So what you see is the chord, the structure of the chord. In the case of the first one, you'd see X7 sharp 11. Now, to build that chord so that there's an upper structure triad, and that upper structure triad is is an actual triad that sits on top of the chord, but it contains chord tones and extensions of that chord. I use this a lot when I'm writing. For instance, let's say I've got the basic tonality of the chord established in the trombone section. It's a C7. But I get the 9th and I get the 11th and I get the 13th by putting an upper structure triad in the trumpet parts. Well, I started looking at this, and it was a way to show piano players how to have better voicings. In fact, I'm going to have Alex show you that right now. In the key of C, I'm going to have him play the guide tones, the E and the B flat, in his left hand. So those notes are, it looks like a fraction, this formula. So those are on the bottom, below the line. Those are his guide tones. That tells you what type of a chord it is. Now you see a 2 on top of the line, and that 2 means you go up one step from C to D, and he plays a D triad in his right hand. Now, when he plays them together, you hear, absent of the root, you don't hear the root because that would be played by the bass player, but you're going to hear the 3rd, the 7th, and then that upper structure triad on top is D, F sharp, A, which is the 9, the sharp 11, and the 13. And there you've got a very resonant voicing to that chord. Now, what does that mean to me? Because I'm playing what they call a monotonal instrument. It only plays one note at a time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore below the line, because I figure the guitar player is probably going to be playing that. Alex is going to be playing that. The bass player is going to be playing the root. So what I'm going to do is just focus on that triad. So here, basically what I'm doing is I'm showing you a way to deal with some of the hardest chords there are to improvise to, thinking of triads. I mean, I'm looking at C7 sharp 11, I'm thinking of D triad. And that's a lot easier for my tiny brain to figure out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have Alex play this in tempo now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the notes that were above the line. There's my triad, and we're going to do this in tempo, and I'll construct my ideas based on that upper structure triad. Here we go. 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3. So even though I was just thinking about a major triad, like I said, I was hitting those colorful notes of the chord, and it made my solo sound a little bit more sophisticated as a result. Now we're going to do another one. If you look at the graphic, and you're going to see, let's do the 3rd one down. This is going to be a dominant 7th chord with a flat 9 and a flat 5. So if you look at the fraction, as it were, thinking about math, which I'm not very good at, what you do is you build a triad built on the flat 5. Now we're going to go in the same key, and the flat 5 in this key for me, well, for Alex, is going to be a G flat. Okay, so now I'm going to build a chord with a G flat over top of that 3 and 7. Let's hear Alex play the chord first. Okay, now this is a chord you're not going to hear played for long durations of time because it's usually a chord that's passing into another chord. But for right now, I'm just going to play a solo based on that flat 5 upper structure triad. 1, a 2, a 1, 2, 3. So as you can see, my thought process is a very simple one. I'm thinking of major triads, but again, I'm isolating all those colorful chord tones because that got the flat 5 in there, it got the flat 9 in there. It's all those what I call money notes. They're money. They're important. So this is a great way to isolate those important tones. Now I'm going to do one final example from these upper structure triads, and this is going to be for a suspended chord. And on suspended chords, now Alex was playing a third and a seventh for guide tones. Now what we do with the left hand of the piano, if this was a piano voicing exercise, is you would just start by playing a root sound in the left hand, which would be 1 and 5, and then put your upper structure triad on top of that. The upper structure triad in this case is built on the flat 7. So in this case, you're playing in C, right? Yes. So in this case, he's going to be playing what sounds like a C13 sus, but what is happening actually is I'm going to be building my solo on the flat 7 or on the B flat triad while he plays the C13 sus. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So now we've shown a few ways that we can use these upper structure triads in our solos. Now, one time, I must have had way too much time on my hands that day. I figured out how many chords this would work for. Now, keep in mind, you might have a variation on that chord. Like, let's say, for instance, you had a 7th chord with a sharp 11 and a sharp 9. Well, now what you do is you use the formula that's closest to that chord you see and then add that extra note in there. So if you take that into consideration, you can use this formula to negotiate the notes or the chords for, I think it's 288 alter dominant and dominant sus chords. That's a lot. So this is a pretty valuable skill, and I hope you can find a way to work it into your solos as well when you see one of those chords with all those parentheses after it. Well, throughout these 2 master classes, I've been talking about various techniques, boundaries that we needed to observe, and basically you're going to hear a whole lot of rules when it comes to music theory and jazz theory. One thing that I want to make sure that I stress, especially if you're an advanced improviser, is the fact that rules are there to get us started. But sometimes some of the nicest music and the most creative music comes when a composer or a jazz improviser either bends or breaks the rules in such a way that he develops his own or her own very unique sound by bending those rules around a little bit just so it makes the music more interesting. But if we use them as a starting point, we can really have a great launching pad for our creativity. Well, I so appreciate your attention during this second master class and the first one as well. And we're starting to come close to the closing here, but I would just like to review a few things. And this would be, and I'm going to read this off of a list that I'm going to project for you. We're going to review the tools that a jazz improviser needs. And what I did is I arranged these into little headings. Into skill, which starts with an S, opportunity, which starts with an O, listening, which starts with an L, and originality, which is another O. If you take those first letters, S-O-L-O, it's solo. How clever. Let's start with skill. The skills that we need, the improviser must possess a technical command of the instrument. We talked about that. The improviser must possess a vocabulary of scales and arpeggios. The improviser must have an understanding of basic chord construction. And finally, in that heading, the improviser must have an understanding of melodic integrity. This is something that we didn't really talk about a lot, but I would like to just add a little side note about melodic integrity. Always think about who your audience is. Most of the people in your audience, they're not musicians. So when you're feeling a little bit guilty about the fact that your solo got a little bit melodic and it wasn't technically impressive to all your musician friends, that melodic section was probably the part the audience likes the most. So make sure to include that in your solos. Next, we have opportunity. The improviser needs encouragement from the teacher or an audience. And the improviser needs the opportunity to perform with other players, with a jazz ensemble, whether it's a combo or a big band or what have you. Next, we move to L, which is listening. This is so important. The improviser needs an awareness and appreciation of jazz history. also needs to listen to accomplished jazz musicians so that we can imitate them. And the last one is an understanding of the jazz concept, whether it's a swing concept, the many Latin rhythms, and any other type of style, funk, whatever. The last one is originality. The improviser needs to combine the knowledge of the jazz language with emotion and with viewpoint. In other words, tell your own story. We all need to be storytellers. Many times, more advanced improvisers tend to lean on technique, but they're not really telling a story that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So always remember that we want our solos to be just like a book. If you were writing a novel, you wouldn't write a novel and then put the chapters all out of order. You want to make sure that there's continuity and that there's a story to be told, and you can tell a story beautifully with music. What I'd like to do now is one very quick demonstration having to do, since I was talking about technique. Many times we play some really amazing stuff that all of our musician buddies will think is just totally awesome, and I want to give you an example of that. Let's say you're playing a fast line in the middle of a solo, something like this. Now, to me and to another musician, that may sound pretty neat. What some of your audience might hear is this. They don't understand all that theoretical stuff that's happening in that fast line, and they might just hear some gibberish, something that just sounds like a bunch of flurry of activity. So once again, once you've wowed your audience with that technique, always keep coming back to the melody or to something that sounds melodic, even if the idea is a little bit slower, a little bit easier to play. But those people are going to love that beautiful sound and a melody that sounds like something that they could sing or dance to. So to put that into other words, we need to make sure that our solo is designed to express as opposed to impress. If we're expressing an honest viewpoint of our ideas and our creativity, don't worry, they're going to be impressed by that. Once again, thank you so very much for watching my 2 master classes. I'm so looking forward later this week to hearing the bands that are participating in the festival. And again, my sincere hope is that when all this COVID pandemic is over, that I'll be allowed to come out to see this in person, to meet some of you, to hear your wonderful music, and to work with all of you. Thank you so very much again. Once again, Jeff Jarvis from Long Beach. Thanks so much. If you happen to be interested in any of the publications that I have out, like I said, there's a lot of big band charts that are available most of them through Kendor Music, some with Alfred, some with UNC Jazz Press, or any of the books. I have jazz pedagogy books, etude books, duet books, solo collections. I'm going to provide you with a graphic that has all the links to the various publishers and some pictures, some sample pictures of the books. But once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to do this masterclass for you.